hesitate. If you had a question, ask the question. If you've got a comment or a concern, raise the comment or concern. That's why I want to do it this way. I am recording the session, and I'll post it to a class YouTube channel when everything is done for the people who won't be able to make the synchronous sessions. So that's pretty much it to start with. I think right now I'll still have the paper be due the same time as was previously scheduled for. So I think that's next, not this coming weekend, but the following weekend. So be working on that a little bit. I'll be holding office hours on Zoom, but we can also talk via email too, or we can make appointments. The appointments will also themselves be Zoom appointments, but we can make that definitely work for people. Let's see if I think of anything else. Oh, the daily assignments, hopefully everyone was able to make that work. Pretty straightforward, right? The same thing you've been turning in, just the 2 sentences, just turned in using as a Canvas quiz. And I'll go through and grade those at a later time. So yeah, hope you all had a good break. It's probably a weird break. Odd times that we're living in, certainly. Any questions and anything before we get started, or should just jump right in? Go ahead, you should be unmuted.
I was actually not able to access the reading, and I did everything that I was supposed to do. I logged into the library website and then clicked on the link, and for some reason it just wouldn't load. And I submitted that I couldn't get access to it in the reading
their website collapsed yesterday afternoon sometime. I tried the last night, send out a link to a, I'm sure, highly legal Polish website that was the same thing. If you weren't able to see that, that's fine. I know there were technical problems with that. Just make sure you find the link, because we'll be doing another Nietzsche reading on Tuesday, and if it's still not working, you should still be able to use that lovely Polish link that I discovered. Okay. Thank you, Poland, for your lack of copyright care. And you all paid for it. That was what's so frustrating about it. CSU actually paid to get you all access to that thing, so it's quite annoying that it didn't work. But so yeah, that's fine for today. I know there was that technical problem, but at least hopefully most people were able to find some version of the reading. Good. Any other questions before we begin? All right, then let's get started a little bit. We're doing this sort of second. What we're going to do in this sort of second part of the course is we're going to shift to moving beyond the sort of initial framework of Taylor. He was going to be sort of this sort of helpful framework that we'll use to sort of start thinking about this question of what religion is, sort of see it as our sort of modern sense of it as something that's very much historically rooted in a very long trajectory. And now we're going to sort of try to move beyond that Taylor initial starting point with the Taylor, and now actually try to sort of interrogate it a little using some other resources, what's actually going on here with this idea of religion. So I figured it'd be helpful maybe, because it's been a while, let's just briefly review sort of where we ended up the Taylor reading on, right? So we ended up that Taylor's basic claims in the last 500 years or so, Western religion became intertwined with this kind of civilizing effort, right? That it's not that we're going to make people quite literally less violent initially, right? In the 1500s, it was like, we're going to try to stop people from fighting honor duels in the middle of the street, right? And indeed, this is perhaps a quite noble objective, but it was sort of, this objective was a really pronounced change in how human beings were sort of brought up or educated historically, right? Where sort of, we now need to be the kind of thing that controls ourselves and rationalizes ourselves in a very fundamental sense. This is a religious objective, but it's also tied in up with politics and sort of sense of civilization, with reason, with science, and with morality. Right? It's really important for the story that Taylor wants to tell, that Christian morality doesn't get lost in all of this, it gets transformed in all of this and starts to take on new forms, right? The sort of universalizing agape or over God's universal love for all beings that we're supposed to be cultivating in ourselves in the Middle Ages, that doesn't disappear. It takes on a sort of more disinterested sort of economic form where I become aware of my activities as the sort of economic agent and make the world sort of better in that regard. over the last 100 years, this sort of equation of these various sorts of elements became challenged in various kinds of ways. This created, for the first time, Taylor thinks, the possibility of what he was calling an exclusive humanism, a genuinely anti-religious attitude, right? Where someone could simply say, yeah, no, I'm just going to drop the religion part out. I'll keep civilization, I'll keep reason, I'll keep morality, right? I'm just going to drop out the reason, right? Or the religion part, right? You see this with all the signs you sometimes see on campus or whatever, like, you can be moral without God, right? That sort of attitude where I'm just breaking off one piece of the equation, right? That's one piece of it. But there's also other kinds of ways in which the equation gets challenged. Other kinds of alternatives start to emerge. You have romanticism, which is deeply suspicious of the way in which this sort of like self-controlling rationalism sort of sees us as being harmed by it. You've got people who identify as spiritual but not religious, who what their fundamental objective or their fundamental goal is to sort of engage in a personal spiritual quest, one that's not taking place through any of the sort of large established Orthodox churches. And then you'll have, what we'll do with stuff today, there's stuff like Nietzschean postmodernism, right? Where it's sort of a radical challenge to the entire equation and the entire history of Western thought altogether, and rejecting sort of all of it, all part and parcel. And all of this is what Taylor is calling the secular age. The secular age is this time period where it's now possible to have all of these various things as live possibilities for the overwhelming majority of people, right? Even if they're not live in the sense that I could ever imagine leaving my native church or the church of my fathers. Nevertheless, I know other people do, and I don't think all of them are evil or crazy, right? I'm aware that there are many ways of life available to me or open to me. Okay. So this doesn't eliminate religion, the secular age, according to Taylor. What Taylor means by religion is any way of life where you identify human flourishing with something transcendent, right? Where you're not just looking for sort of ordinary, mundane human happiness. You want something more, and not just anything more. So the Romantics kind of wanted something more, and Nietzsche's going to want something more. But this more that you're looking for is something that transcends normal human existence, right? Normally we'd call this transcendent thing a god, right? But there's other traditions, like Buddhism, for example, that Taylor wants to say are still religious. They still have something transcendent, but they might not have a deity. So transcendent is sort of the broader category. And that this transcendent being plays an explanatory role in how I understand the world, and it also plays a practical role in how I go about living my life. Right? For example, I live with this transcendent being in mind, something like that. And so that's what religion means. Religion is still possible in a secular age, right? If we're all now sort of consumed by this idea of authenticity and want to find our own spiritual path, there's nothing stopping our spiritual path from sort of ending with something transcendent and finding our happiness in something transcendent, right? It's just sort of transformed the scope of it. Okay. So all that's just a little bit review of the first half of the semester, I guess. So before we go any further, I guess, questions, thoughts, comments, just on that beginning point. All right. Good. So now let's go to the next piece. So the thing that this definition of religion that Taylor has given us should leave us wondering about is what is meant by this idea of the transcendent. Right? And this is actually where we sort of ended the last class with. We were just sort of starting to answer this question. Right? The idea of God's a super weird one. Right? So okay, this is something we should actually be able to sort of talk about. So I'm going to ask a question, and I think you can all give me a relatively straightforward answer to it. So I think you would all agree with me, sad though it might be to admit, unicorns do not exist. Very sad, perhaps. What does it mean to say that a unicorn does not exist? Try it out. Go ahead. You are unmuted. Go ahead.
Am I coming through?
Say it again. Sorry, I missed it.
Am I coming through?
Yep, you're coming through. You're good.
All right, awesome. I mean, I guess if you say a unicorn doesn't exist, you're saying it's an imagination. It was created not in the world, but in someone's mind. You can't see it. You can't acknowledge its existence.
Yeah, good. I think something like that seems right. It's almost like, okay, if I go around the world and I look really, really carefully, I'm never going to find a unicorn, no matter how much I look, how carefully I look, right? Whereas, like, What does it mean to say that my cat exists? It means I could go upstairs and find her, right? It means something kind of like that, like seeable, touchable, locatable in some sense. Does anyone think that's true about God? Like, can I go upstairs and find God? Is that going to be how this works? Like, shake his hand? Right? I mean, is that any religious tradition, like literally any religious tradition throughout human history has thought that? Go ahead, you're unmuted.
I mean, I feel like they wouldn't necessarily say like you could literally like grab him,
Right.
but I think in some way they'd say I feel like I've heard this before, at least
Mhm.
myself, that he's tangible and is in everything in a way. So he's not
Yeah.
necessarily like, he's literally like everywhere. Like, I don't, if you kind of get what I mean by that point.
Yeah, no, it's super weird. You're right. Like God is in all of us, but like not in us. But again, it just almost just want to point out how weird this is, right? Like if God is in me, it's not like, well, I can't just like get an X-ray machine and find God, right? Can I feel God? I mean, people sometimes do talk about finding God, and frequently it seems to have the sense of like almost like a feeling, like feeling the presence of God within themselves, maybe. But again, that's really different than finding the unicorn, right? Like if I was going to find the unicorn, I pretty much know what to look for. I know where I'm looking. Really, no religious tradition thinks that God's that kind of thing, right? Even go back to the ancient Greeks, they didn't think that either. Right? Their gods are highly personified, at least in the stories. They're these loud figures. But like you see Zeus, or you see Zeus's activity when you see a thunderbolt, right? Zeus himself is never going to show up to you in a way that you'll unambiguously know is Zeus, right? The only actually exception to this, and it's kind of a weird exception to this, is actually in Christianity itself, right? Christ himself was a guy. You actually could go up to Christ and shake his hand and pat him on the shoulder and he could touch you, right? Like in a very literal sense. But again, if someone who's going to deny Christianity, they're not going to not necessarily be denying that there was some guy named Christ, right? They're going to deny that guy Christ was God, right? So this idea of a transcendent thing is a super odd one. Right? It doesn't sort of cohere with a lot of our normal sort of categories that by which we sort of go about characterizing the world. And so we're going to need to be careful and spend some real time working on trying to figure out exactly what do we mean by a transcendent thing. That's why we're going to start with Nietzsche. Nietzsche's this virulent atheist, right? That's where Nietzsche's to make that super clear, right? Indeed, he's sort of like more atheist than atheists. Like he despises most atheists because he doesn't think they're atheist enough, right? But the reasoning is he's really super opposed to this idea of the transcendent. And he actually, as a result, is going to do a reasonably, at least compelling starting job articulating what it is that he means by the transcendent, what it is that he's denying. So we're going to spend 3 days on Nietzsche to sort of start the second half of the semester off. We're going to spend 2 days with looking at different parts of the genealogy of morals. And then we're going to read an essay by Heidegger, who's the later thinker who uses Nietzsche a lot. We'll talk a little bit about who Heidegger is later on. Nietzsche's, you might have, if you've heard of Nietzsche, you might have heard, he's really famous for having said, "God is dead." That's his quote from Nietzsche. It's actually not a quote from Nietzsche. He's quoting Hegel, because Hegel said it. But Nietzsche, at the very least, this idea of God being dead is very carefully associated with Nietzsche. And so the secondary piece we're going to read is from Martin Heidegger's On Nietzsche's Word, God is Dead, where he actually tries to unpack what it is that Nietzsche means by that. Because again, it's super weird, right? Like, it's not like God like got sick or something. Like, Nietzsche's not saying that, right? Like, what could that possibly mean to say that God is dead? It's going to have to do with this idea of transcendence, right? Nietzsche's basic claim is going to be that we in modernity can no longer accept the idea of something that's genuinely transcendent. And so God is dead to us is almost what that's going to mean. And so we're going to sort of play with this and try to get a pretty solid idea of what's actually at stake with this idea of transcendence. And then we'll look at how other thinkers are using the idea sort of earlier. That's my rough plan for at least the first couple of weeks of this semester. So how are we doing so far? Any questions at this point? All right. So for fun, because this is super weird doing this online, here's a stuffed doll of Nietzsche. That a student gave me. Right? And here's the will the power bar, because that's Nietzsche's big thing. That is the student was super into Nietzsche and gave me that, so I thought that would be fun. And indeed, actually, hold on 1 second. Another student then got me a Socrates toy. And it's going to be super great because as much as Nietzsche hates two people above all else, he hates Christ and he hates Socrates. So Nietzsche beating up Socrates is going to be one of our objectives today to figure out what's going on there. So there you go, the little puppet show portion of this incredibly odd online thing that we're doing. All right, so any questions or thoughts, or should we jump in a little bit to the Nietzsche? Right. Also, just remember, you can also send me questions and stuff on the chat too. It'll take me a little bit longer to see it. All right. So let's begin. Nietzsche's fundamental concern, what Nietzsche's fundamentally interested in this reading that we're doing today, is what he's going to distinguish between two different systems of values. Right. On the one hand, there's going to be what he calls master, or he has various sorts of names. He calls master morality, he calls it at various points. Or so what he sometimes also calls it aristocratic value. So that's on the one hand. And then on the other hand, we're going to have what he calls, again, variously. Nietzsche is not super big on drawing careful distinctions between different things. He's variously going to call this slave morality. He's going to call it Jewish morality or Christian morality. Or he calls it Buddhism at one point. He's painting with a very large brush here. Or plebeian values, the values of the mob. Right. And what we're going to predominantly be concerned with today, this isn't going to give us the full story of what we mean by transcendence, but it's going to set us up a little bit to start telling the story as we go. We're just going to try to figure out what the distinction is between these two sort of sets of values, or these two sort of systems, ways of understanding what's important in the world, right? Our special topic today, the thing we're going to focus on most of all, is what do you mean when you say the word good? What does good mean, right? So Nietzsche began, as you all probably saw, let's even just pause for a second. Nietzsche's super weird, right? Like you all read some of this now, right? He is all over the place. He's constantly attacking people, right? He trades in insulting people. He's an incredibly odd thinker. I'm not a huge fan of Nietzsche. I used to like him a little bit more, but now he's a little bit annoys me now with the sort of the vitriol of a lot of his attacks. But what is he actually doing? Let's talk about a little bit before we even go into the content. What's his actual objective in all of this? Why is he writing like this? His goal is to completely tear down the way in which we think things are good or important or meaningful in the world. Right? He thinks we're doing it wrong. We've been doing it wrong for about 250, maybe 2,500 years, ever since Plato. Plato and Christ, he hates both of them probably equally in different ways. But for a very long time, he thinks we've been doing it really wrong, right? He doesn't want us to go back to the past. He has no interest in that regard whatsoever. He has no interest in returning us to that sort of aristocratic system of valuation. He doesn't think it's possible, and he wouldn't want to do it even if he could. Right? He actually, for all the stuff that he says that sounds wildly anti-Semitic, he actually thinks Jewish morality is way more interesting than Greek morality. It's actually, in a sense, it's made us far more interesting that we've been corrupted by it. Right? Also, anytime he says Jewish, he's also just saying Christian. I mean, because the Jewish thinker par excellence for him is Christ. Right? So they are one and the same. Jewish morality and Christian morality are sort of part and parcel of the same objection to him. He wants to tear all of this system down to create the possibility of us looking for something new. What is the new thing? Right? He doesn't know. That's actually the funny punchline. He has no idea what's going to come next. Right? He frequently writes in this incredibly prophetic mode, right? Where he's imagining some future human who he calls Zarathustra, who will be the new human, the Superman. That's actually where the, like Superman from the comics that actually comes from Nietzsche, right? The Übermensch, right? The Overman or the Superman. This is going to be the man of tomorrow, the man to come, right? The one who will be free of all of the sort of mistakes we've made in the past, right? And he doesn't know what this will look like, though. He sort of like guesses a few times, like he has some like gestures at what he hopes it might look like, but he himself doesn't know. All he's doing is explicitly trying to tear down the old world. That's all he's into. That's his fundamental project, right? What he's trying to tear down in today's reading is our sense of what the word good means. All of us, he thinks, assume that what does it mean to say Steve's a good person? It means that Steve is selfless, right? And we talk this way all the time, right? Like who's the good person during the coronavirus outbreak? The good person is the one who gives their last carton of toilet paper to their elderly neighbor. Right? And who's the bad person? The bad person is the one who goes to the store and steals all the toilet paper and puts it in the cart and won't let anyone else get it. Right? That's the good. The good person is selfless. The bad person is the selfish person. Right? Nietzsche thinks that not only is this just kind of historically false, that's not what the word good has always meant. Indeed, it's relatively recent that the word good would have meant that. He thinks it's also harmful that we think that that's what the word good meant too. Right? It's unhealthy. His standard, Nietzsche's standard, the way that he's going to want to evaluate the world is in terms of health. Right? A good system of morality, a good system of values is one that's going to encourage us to lead strong, powerful, healthy lives. Right? And so while he thinks it's a dead end, the master morality is going to be a far healthier morality, he thinks, than the slave morality, right? Because the slave morality, there's something going to be stifling in it, sickly, unhealthy, as he's looking at it. By the way, one of the fundamental paradoxes of Nietzsche is that he himself was like quite sickly, chronically ill his entire life, right? And a little irony of him. Go ahead, you're unmuted.
Yeah, so on the topic of master and slave morality, it almost seems like Nietzsche is making a class-based argument for the production of morality, but I feel like he wouldn't appreciate those terms.
He's fine with it, actually, though we'd have to understand class in a non-Marxist way.
Right.
If we understand class as almost just stratas of society, he'd be fine. He's fine with using class. And indeed, it actually, like, all of this is coming from two different aristocratic classes. It's really the conflict between two different aristocratic classes that leads to all of this. What he's calling the slave morality, it has its origin, as far as he can tell, in the priestly class, right? In the people whose job it was to remain ritualistically pure, which we'll talk about in a little bit as we sort of go. Because he thinks the Jews were the priestly people par excellence, as far as he's concerned. They were sort of the preeminently priestly people. And then then you had the fight between the priests and the aristocrats, and the aristocrats win because they have swords and the priests didn't, basically, right? So it becomes kind of like more like what we would call a class distinction. But at first, it's really just the distinction between the two different strata of society, rather than poor and rich necessarily. Particularly the nobles. The nobles don't define themselves and don't really care about poor people at all. That's actually not what they're concerned with, as we'll see in a second. So does that answer the question? Was that helpful?
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Yep. Good. Any others? Any other questions before we start? All right, let's start drawing the distinction. And I'm going to go a little bit more schematically or systematically than he actually does with it. Okay. For this master morality, we'll start here. What does good mean? Good means me. That's what it means, right? And people like me, right? Who is he thinking of here? So let's do an example. You can do all kinds of different places. He does it all with various sorts of people. He thinks this would have applied to older Japanese cultures to older Arabian cultures to Greco-Roman civilization to Norse civilization. What we're talking about here, we're talking about this master aristocratic morality. We're talking about basically warrior nobles, right? People who were rulers of their societies, right? Right. We're talking about the nobility, right? So, okay, I'm good. What do I do? What does it mean to say that I'm good? Well, what are my characteristics? I'm strong, right? I have to be. That's how I sort of go off and conquer people, right? I'm also beautiful. Again, I'm not talking about me personally. We're talking about, right? I am beautiful, right? Ugliness is a sign that you're actually not good. Indeed, why? Because precisely who had access to things like baths? The nobles took baths. You know who aren't taking baths? Slaves. Slaves were not taking baths, right? So I'm strong, I'm beautiful. What else am I? I am noble, right? Literally, I am the highborn of society. I'm the noble class, the ruling class of society, right? I'm in charge of things. I command people. People have to do what I say. And to be very clear, why do people do what I say? Because otherwise I'll like hit them with a stick, right? There's no notice that none of these words are moral words in our normal sense of the term. There's no selflessness here, right? I rule because I'm bigger, stronger, and I hit people with sticks, right? And what do I do? What's the mark of my goodness? I do great things. Right? I go forth, I do great, noble deeds, right? And these sort of prove that I am one of the good, right? And again, what do I mean by great noble deeds here? I'm not giving money to charity. I'm like going to like other people and clubbing them in the head and making them slaves, right? Or I'm conquering a city that didn't deserve it in the slightest, right? But it was just there and I hadn't conquered it, so I went and conquered it because it's great to conquer things. Look how great I am that I conquered things, right? The shocking thing, if you actually read Greek myths, this always stuns us now, is just how utterly just amoral the heroes all seem to be, right? Like, if you've read the Iliad, why does Achilles do everything that he does in the Iliad? Well, he spends most of it sulking in his tent because King Agamemnon took his slave girl away. So he gets really cross and decides he's just going to sulk in his tent. And then his best friend dies in the battlefield, so he gets really angry and murders about half of Troy. And then he basically goes back to sulking in his tent for a while. And then he basically like sort of calms down a little bit, and they hold a big funeral, and that's the end of the Iliad. That's it. There's no moral lesson. We didn't learn anything. We didn't become better people, right? Like, there's no moralism here. There's no behaving well, right? And everyone involved is pretty aware that Achilles is acting like a petulant child throughout the entire story. And yet Achilles is the Greek hero, right? He was the one that the Greeks looked toward to teach them how a man lives, right? It's not moral. It's not, and you would have, when you had the sort of the first wave of Christian scholars in the 1800s reading these stories, they had no idea what to do with them, right? Because what do Christian epics look like? Because indeed there were indeed Christian epics, right? You read like the Beowulf, for example, right? A key part of the Beowulf story is Beowulf's moral virtue, his moral excellence, what a good Christian he is. Same thing if you read the Arthurian legends, the legends of King Arthur, right? A key thing is that all of them were these outstanding moral individuals, and actually what is it in the Arthurian legends that leads to the destruction of the Knights of the Round Table? They're destroyed by vice, by wickedness. The morality that Nietzsche is arguing was true for the aristocratic sect, the oldest form of morality, completely unconcerned with things like morality. Right? Simply not concerned with it. What does it mean to say that I am good? It means that I'm stronger than you, right? What does bad mean then? Well, bad just would be the opposite of all of these things. Bad people not like me. right? So low-born, weak, ugly, right? Clever. It's actually super weird. Clever is an insult in most of the old Greek stuff. Like the only of the heroes that it's attributed to is Odysseus, and Odysseus is frequently looked upon by suspicion by everyone else, right? Because if I'm big and strong, I don't need to be clever. I'll just hit you with my club, right? Who needs to be clever? People who aren't as good with a club as me, right? The weak, they need to be clever, right? People who are just don't do anything impressive with their lives. Right? Unimpressive folk, right? And the unhappy, right? I am happy because no one outbeats me with this club, right? Or if maybe they do, maybe I die in battle, but that's great too. That itself is a noble deed, right? There's actually, Nietzsche argues, a kind of like fundamental pity implicit in the words that are used to describe the bad within master morality. There's always a kind of like pity, like, oh yeah, it would really suck to be like that. I'm really glad I'm not. And now I'm going to go forth and like enslave them all, right? It doesn't follow forth into the Christian sense, so therefore I'll go like tend to these unhappy people. It's like, yeah, it sucks to be them. Man, that's awful. Well, better get back forth to the raping, pillaging, and plundering of them. Right? Happiness itself is a mark of goodness, right? And so all of this just sounds to Nietzsche like a super healthy life. Right? Where he means it's almost like in a super literal sense. It's one of activity, right? One of vitality, right? One of strength, one that values strength, filled with happy people who are going to sing songs, get really angry, murder their best friend in a fit of rage, feel bad about it for a couple days, and then forget about it 3 weeks from now, right? They're going to be happy, forgetful, and relatively stupid, as far as Nietzsche is concerned. These aren't clever people, right? And indeed, that's actually why Nietzsche doesn't want to go back. We actually became far more interesting on Nietzsche's estimation once we actually stopped having that way of evaluating the world. There's no depth to these nobles, these warriors, right? They're not that clever. They don't really think great thoughts. They really just basically run around clubbing things with large sticks, right? And that was indeed, there's something healthy and great about it, but it's not interesting, right? Everything Nietzsche's going to say about the sort of the Jewish morality, it's going to be incredibly insulting, and indeed it's intended to be incredibly insulting. He also thinks they're way more interesting. Like they are what has made human being interesting. The Buddhists, the Christians, the Jews, they have made us interesting by turning our instincts against ourselves, right? The noble morality, it's all instinct for them. It's nothing that interesting. The interesting stuff is going to come from this side of the story. That's where interest is going to, where it's interested in. It's also where unhealthiness is going to sort of start to emerge. So let's pause for a second. How are we doing so far with the master morality? Any questions, comments, thoughts at this point? Go ahead, Rachel, you're unmuted.
How would they define like people that were like them versus people not like them? Like what drew the line between people? Yeah,
frequently. So just as a pure question of a historical fact, it's actually frequently linguistic. So people who speak the language like me. But I think we talked about this before. Barbarian, the word for that in a lot of these ancient cultures, it always basically means people who speak a different language. So the Greek barbarians were people who didn't speak Greek, right? And what did the Greeks all have in common? They all have in common speaking Greek. But the other sign of it just is like, you sort of know it if you see it, right? Like if you're going forth and like challenge me to an honor duel, you're probably one of the people like me. If I run through your town, kill a bunch of chickens, and then pass out drunk and you just sort of cower in a corner, you're not like me. right? Sort of the deed, the strength, the vitality of your behavior shows whether or not you're really like me. Does that help? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
The interesting thing, we'll talk about this more in Nietzsche about a little later. As far as Nietzsche is concerned, this aristocratic system of evaluation, it doesn't really think about the bad people that much. They're not really. They're the ants you incidentally step on and think, oh, sucks that I stepped on that ant. What you actually think about is other noble people who become opportunities for you to sort of do a great deed by fighting them, right? Nietzsche argues that the aristocrats loved their enemies because their enemies aren't the bad. Their enemies are other nobles who they can fight with, and then either die gloriously or win a glorious victory. Other hand us up. Ian, go ahead. You should be unmuted. Oh, hold on. You're not unmuted. Now you should be unmuted.
Okay, cool. I was going to ask, do you need to be born to be noble? Like, do you have to be born good to be good? Is what I mean?
Yeah, on this system. A little bit, in terms of how they thought of it, yes. This is something that's sort of hereditary. The sons of, you'd expect great things from the sons of heroes, right? But also, all you in a sense have to do is do a great thing, though, right? You can, in a sense, you can sort of buy entry into the club a little bit by doing something great, right? I guess it's a little bit egalitarian in a sense. I mean, it's sort of weird to call it that, right? But in a sense, the baseline condition is doing something noble, excellent, and great. So anyone who's done something noble, excellent, and great can sort of prove that they belong in the club. You
so
actually
there's a glorious warrior aspect to it. Is that what?
Very much so. Yeah. Very much so. I mean, and it's going to vary. I mean, Nietzsche's speaking in such enormous brushstrokes that it's going to vary situation by situation. But there is something by and large accurate about almost just linguistically. He was actually originally a linguist. That was what Nietzsche was actually originally was. He wasn't a philosopher by trade, and he is right just linguistically. If you actually just look at the words that meant good and bad and what those words were associated with in all of these old languages, they do kind of correspond pretty neatly with what he's saying they did. They don't correspond with anything like selflessness or anything of the sort. They correspond with this kind of warrior kind of ethos. In what sense is Achilles good? In the sense that, as one of my classics professors put it, in the sense that he's the human atom bomb. He's just really good at killing people. And so therefore he's good, right? Therefore he's excellent. He's noble, he's virtuous, he's all of these terms, right? Because what it means to be noble, good, excellent is just to be good at killing people, right? It means to be this kind of great warrior.
What if you are good at a different trade? You can be good if you're the priest, or you can be good if you're I don't know. Can you be good if you are really good at your trade, or does it have to be killing people, or is that just an example that you were using?
No, it actually really does have to be. Maybe it might not have to be literally killing people, but things of that sort. Yeah, because actually, no. Someone who's really good at making a table, it's a good carpenter. They are not. They are not this. Right? They are not noble. They are not good. They are not excellent. We look down on someone who made a table, right? And this is actually shocking to us. They look down on doctors.
Oh, wow.
To us, that just seems insane, right? But they looked down on doctors. They thought being a doctor was kind of a shameful profession.
Why?
Right? Because you're around sick, dead people. There's nothing cool about that.
The presence of bad people makes you bad, even if you're good.
If you why are you hanging around the sick unless you're sickly yourself?
Because being sick meant something different back then.
That's right. Being sick just means, again, go back to the equation, right? Being sick just means bad, right? You're one of the people not like me. Let's add it. That's actually well worth adding to the equation.
So one last thing. If you're noble and you become sick, are you now bad?
Yeah, I mean, it would depend a little bit, right? Like it would depend a little bit. I mean, if you get better, it's fine because humans get colds or whatever, right? But yeah, like if you're like permanently crippled, I mean, you could maybe get by a little bit with your reputation. Like if you had done great deeds in the past, that would still be worth something. But yeah, if you just are sickly and never do anything in your life, sucks to be you. Mm-hmm. And almost like kind of on a quite literal level, right? Like it kind of quite literally sucks to be you. That's sort of the level that they're operating on here. This isn't a very sophisticated system of valuation. It's sort of just like, yeah, that would suck if you were really sickly your whole life. I could come up to you and club you with a giant stick and you couldn't do anything about it. In fact, club, right? Like, and that would suck and that would be bad, right? Like, we have to divorce this idea of badness from any kind of moral sense, right? It's just like bad in the quite literal sense that like, yeah, that would be sucky, right? Your life would be unfortunate if people could come up to you and club you because you were too sickly to defend yourself, right? You would never do anything noble, anything great, right? Yeah, so does that help? Does that sort of...
Yeah, no, definitely. I just was like trying to kind of find that line and distinction, and I think that's what it was.
Yeah. You know? It's how utterly amoral all of this is. That's what should strike all of us as strange. All right, go ahead.
How did they approach aging? Because if they had respect for sickly or they had respect for great deeds, if you had done them in the past but were no longer capable of doing them, did they still hold any amount of respect for you? Or did that go away as soon as you were like no longer in your prime and no longer like healthy?
You still have it. You would still have it because, I mean, these people, as Nietzsche's sort of telling the story, they're not heartless exactly, right? Like, they'd still love their parents just as much as anyone else loved their parents. They also might fly into a rage and clock their parent in the face and then feel really bad about it, right? But they're going to still have sort of familial love and all of that, right? But they would be like, yeah, it's going to suck now that you're old, right? So like, you quite literally are no longer as great as you were, right? And so maybe at the very least, you know, I'm going to take your place at the assembly, or I'm going to take your place at the next meeting, is you can no longer go forth and do all these great deeds. I mean, there's honor for the elderly, but it's sort of like a reverential, like you go over there and do your elderly things, and us young folk will do the young folk business. Does that help? Does that?
Yeah, I think so. But they didn't give any credence to like experience or wisdom.
They did, like, they would value, perhaps, it depends a little bit on how old too. That's a little bit, there's different levels of being old, right? If you're in your 50s, that's one thing. If you're in your 80s, that's a different thing, right? But they did indeed value experience, and if you were still capable of giving really good experience, they value you, right? Value your advice, value your counsel, right? Take advantage of the stories you can tell about the past, right? It's more like, once, inevitably, as all of us are going to do, if we live that long, once you start to slip a little bit, then you're like, okay, grandpa, go to the old, not even old folks' home exactly, just like, do stuff old people do. Stop trying to take part in what young folks do, right? It's weirdly a meritocracy in a weird sense, right? Like, so long as you're capable of doing it, do it. But once you're not capable of doing it, I'm not going to enslave you anymore because I respect you, but don't be part of the sort of manly business of daily life. You actually, fun fact, the word courage in Greek, it literally just means manliness. That's literally all it just means. To be courageous is to be a man, right? And it's why that people are bewildered when Plato suggests, hey, women can be courageous too. Because it's like literally linguistically, you're saying like women could be men too, right? But Plato's already shifting. We'll talk about this. Part of the reason Nietzsche hates Plato so much is that he's already shifting away from this aristocratic sense of valuation. Nietzsche's transforming these virtues to mean something a little bit different, right? To the sort of perspective where this equation actually made sense, that courage just means being a real man, right, you're not going to be thinking about anything other than on the most baseline, superficial levels. What is it to be courageous? To club your enemies in the head. Right? So long as you can club your enemies in the head, you're in great shape. Once you can't, you're out of luck. Sorry. So is that clear up? That help?
It does. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Let's turn to a little bit now. Let's try to figure out what the slave morality is. But before we do it, we're going to take a little detour. Let's talk about the priestly morality. Right? This is a version of aristocratic morality. A sort of special version of it. And again, if you look at the classes or the social strata in most of these ancient societies, there was usually a pretty sharp dichotomy between the warrior class and the priest class, right? They were both in charge in a sense. They were both high up in society, but they had very different jobs and they lived very different kinds of lives. The priestly morality, it was very similar in a sense. So it's priestly goodness. Again, it's like being like me. Right? But what do I do now? That's the difference. What I do, and we'll talk about this more on Thursday, or no, today's Thursday, Tuesday. What do I do, actually? What I do is refrain from taking part in impure activities. And again, Nietzsche wants to emphasize these are not that clever people. They're not thinking at any sort of deep symbolic level. By impure, we mean like dirty things. Like I don't touch trash. I don't sleep with prostitutes. I don't get blood on my hands. And I don't eat, like, for example, pigs, because pigs are a dirty animal. Right? I refrain from dirty things. Right. Already Nietzsche thinks there's something a bit unhealthy in this. Right? Because whereas for the aristocrats, what are they doing? They're leading this life of sort of like activity, strength, vigor, right? This is a life of refraining from doing things on the aristocratic side. I don't do things. I hold back. I tend to be more passive. I'm precisely not going to go out and club someone in the head with a stick at the very least. Right? That was sort of the preeminent prohibition was on violent action, and the most dangerous form of pollution was blood pollution. That was what they were most of all concerned with, was quite literally not getting blood on their hands in a metaphoric sense, in a very literal sense, getting blood on your hands. Right? That would invite the sort of anger of the gods in various sorts of ways. Right? So this is kind of going to be an in-between between the slave morality and the master morality. Right? Because what's inevitably going to happen, these two things are going to fight. They're going to be in conflict. Right? And who's going to win the conflict? Is it going to be the people who don't club people with sticks? Or the people who club people with sticks? Who's going to win in the fight? Normally, the stick people are going to win, right? And so what ends up happening is that a lot of the sort of priestly classes become kind of enslaved to the warrior classes, right? Particularly when, his preeminent target here is the Jews, right? So what happens to the kingdom of Israel again and again and again? It gets conquered and destroyed by stronger powers. And the Jewish priestly class becomes enslaved either to the Babylonians, to the Persians, or eventually to the Romans themselves. Right? So the priestly class sort of is going to become the slave class and bring its sort of asceticism. This actually might not be a term people are familiar with. Do people know this term of asceticism? Let me define it in case not. Right. This is a philosophy of self, a way of life where you deny yourself various kinds of pleasures. Right. So in Buddhist, monks are ascetics. Right. They refrain from doing various kinds of activities, from drinking, from sex. Hindu yogis are ascetics. Right. These ancient priests are ascetics. They refrain from engaging in various kinds of activities, right? So this asceticism, which was at least first part of something kind of noble within them. It kind of is going to get transferred over to the slave morality once the priestly class becomes increasingly enslaved by the warrior class. So let's just pause for a second. Any questions about the priestly class? This is sort of a little transition side moment. All right, good. Let's go now. Then we're still doing plenty of time. Let's now start working through. Actually, let me go back. Can I erase the aristocratic stuff? Does anyone still need it? Send me a chat message or something if anyone still needs that. I'm okay. I can erase it. All right. So let's now do the other dominant system evaluation. Let's go through what Nietzsche is calling the slave morality. Right. It begins in the opposite direction. It begins by defining evil. Who are the evil ones? The ones oppressing me. That's how it begins. Right? And again, notice here, we were talking about bad, and now we're talking about evil. Right? They both seem as if they're the opposite of good, but for Nietzsche, there's a radical difference in the understandings at play between the two. Right? So the evil are the ones who are enslaving me. Okay, well, what are their characteristics? Well, they're strong. They're beautiful. They're noble. They do violent, let us call it now, deeds. Because indeed, that's what these great deeds always were. They were violent deeds, right? They do violent deeds, right? And they're happy and healthy, right? And I hate them. Why? Nietzsche says for the quite sensible reason that they keep killing me and stealing my stuff, right? As Nietzsche says, there's nothing at all odd with a lamb that would really hate birds of prey that ate it. Because yeah, I mean, that sucks for me, right? The odd thing, the new thing, the clever thing, and again, clever, sort of for Nietzsche in that sense of a little bit of an insult, right? The clever thing was making this not just, I don't like to get eaten, making this, those people who eat me are bad in a very different way. They are fundamentally corrupt in some sense. They are amoral, right? This idea of evil is tied intrinsically to an idea of morality, right? They are the wicked ones. Right? The ones who do foul deeds. Okay, so then in retrospect, good can be defined, right? Notice how this is sort of opposite, right? To the master morality, according to Nietzsche, defines itself in terms of itself. I'm great. Oh yeah, and then there's people who aren't like me, sucks to be them. This is the exact opposite. Those people are awful. So I must be good. And being like me must be good. So again, what does it mean to be like me? To suffer. Those who suffer are the good, right? Those who are sick are the good, right? Those who passively turn the other cheek. But of course, what does that actually mean, according to Nietzsche? That just means you're not strong enough to fight back, right? Right? Like it's great to say, like, yeah, I'm turning the other cheek, when what you really mean is, I am not strong enough to fight back. Right? But it's clever. But he thinks this is actually really clever, right? Like, that's a great way of like transforming your weakness into something that sounds better, into something that sounds powerful, right? And indeed, cleverness, right? The ability to sort of like, I can't win in a straight fight with you, so I'm going to have to do something tricky and clever. That's a mark of me, right? And we are the ones, so basically the unhappy are the ones who are actually blessed. Right? We are the ones and blessed by God. Right? This intrinsically needs to make reference to something outside the literal facts of the situation. Right? Because just looking at the facts, it's pretty obvious I'm not blessed, right? It's pretty obvious I keep getting enslaved, beaten, stolen from, I'm sick, I have to work for other people come up and like insult me, and I just have to meekly like say like, thank you, sir, may I have another? Like all of that just sounds sucky, right? To say that we the suffering ones are truly the blessed, you have to go beyond what you're actually seeing around you. What you're actually seeing around you is that your life sucks. If you're truly the blessed one, that blessedness is going to have to consist in something other than the life you see around you. So let's pause here. There's more to say about the slave morality, but let's just at least stop there for a second. Questions, thoughts, comments about this move? All right. Are you all getting the sense in which this is still not moral exactly? Right? Because it's, according to Nietzsche, this is all rooted fundamentally in resentment, right? Like, I hate the people who keep oppressing me. That's what's motivating all of this. But it at least has more of a moral feel to it, right? I'm distinguishing good and bad kinds of activities. And what are the good kinds of activities? The good kinds of activities are the ones that precisely don't act like those crazy lunatic warriors act. Because indeed, like, it's important to remember, right? Like, these nobles, these quote-unquote nobles, they're lunatics, right? Like, they are running around starting fights in the middle of the street with random people for no reason. If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh, so this is a really old, one of the oldest stories we have, the Sumerian epic. Gilgamesh is the king of his town, and what he does all day is he gets drunk and wrestles people to death, just like randomly in the street. And everyone's like, wow, this kind of sucks. Right? Because indeed, yeah, that kind of sucks, right? Like, I remember when we were saying at the very beginning, when we were going back to the tailor, right? This idea of the civilization, right? Like, it was a serious problem in the 1500s that noblemen were like fighting blood duels in the middle of the street. Like, Romeo and Juliet was like more or less accurate. That you'd actually just have random gangs of noble families murdering each other for very poor reasons, for very poorly defined reasons, because of nobility or honor, right? This is indeed a rather, I mean, maybe it's fine if you're in it, but if you're not in it, right? This is all a rather bad state of affairs to be in, right? It would really rather be quite preferable if these lunatic nobles stopped acting like this. There's nothing odd in that. The thing that Nietzsche thinks is odd, or at least clever here, is transforming I don't like dying right? Transforming I don't like my master into my master is evil. The first is entirely natural. Of course I don't like my master, right? Of course I don't like being a slave. It would be weird if you did, right? The clever transformation, and he identifies this with the Jews, though he thinks the Christians are the ones who basically inherited it, like the Christians are the ones who perfected it, was turning I don't like being a slave to the person enslaving me is evil, is bad. Right? Bad, not in the sense of just living a kind of an ugly life, but bad in some other sense, because they're the ones leading the good life, right? The weird thing about ancient slavery, it's possible for me to buy my own freedom, and indeed, as a slave, it's possible for me to own other slaves, right? The natural, quote unquote, reaction to this situation is to want to become strong yourself and then dominate other people, right? the sort of idea here is that like, how should this have gone? If this had been a healthy thing, how would this have gone on Nietzsche's idea? The slaves would have said like, grr, I'm going to rise up and then I will be the master. Right? It's really different to say that mastery itself is evil. Right? That's an inversion of the value. That's turning everything on its head. And that's why Nietzsche finds all of this so fascinating. This is the first time, he thinks, that morality value turned upside down. It proves that it's possible, in fact. As he puts it, the victory of the Jews over the Romans. Right? Proves that it's possible all at once for how we evaluate the world to change at a dime. Right? Because what actually happened, we talked about this way back at the beginning of the semester, but let's just remind ourselves. What actually happened in the Roman Empire? The Romans had spent literally 4 centuries murdering the Jews, right? The Romans largely hated them. They thought they were they didn't understand them. They thought they were super weird. They weren't like the other conquered people. When Romans normally conquered a people, they basically just said, believe whatever stupid thing you want, just like also worship our gods. And everyone was like, great, fine, more festivals, right? The Jews were the only ones who were like, no, we're not going to worship your gods, right? And so the Romans didn't understand them. The Jews kept rebelling, which they also hated. Because again, conquered Roman peoples didn't rebel, usually. That just wasn't how it usually went. So the Romans had spent about 4 centuries murdering, enslaving, and oppressing the Jews. Within about literally 30 years, the Romans went from that to having become entirely, as the state religion, worship of a Jewish prophet, Christ. And it's fast. It's 30 years. It's about 30 years between the last anti-Jewish, anti-Christian purges to, yep, Christianity is now the religion of the land. Go ahead, I got you.
Yeah. What time did this happen? Like,
this is right around like, so it's right around like say 2030 to 2070. That's 20.
okay.
Sorry. So not 20, 230, right around 270 or so, maybe a little bit later, but like it happens fast. And it takes a little bit longer for the actual empire to fully convert, but the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire is fast and instantaneous. And once it really gets going, almost instantaneous.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, because early Christianity had basically early on there wouldn't have been a distinction between Jews and Christians. Christianity was a Jewish sect early on. Once the Christian sect wins, in a sense, then it starts to spread through the Roman Empire like wildfire. And literally you go 30 years from like, we're going to feed Christians to lions to let's all become Christian. Which is pretty crazy, actually. That doesn't happen usually, right? That's
yeah.
The only other time something like that happened, and it's after Nietzsche's time. It basically happened in Nazi Germany, right? It happened when the Nazis took over, when it became murder your neighbor rather than thou shalt not murder your neighbor, and then it happened 5 years later once the Nazis collapsed, and it just became just kidding. None of us ever believed any of that stuff. That's basically the only time you saw such a complete and total value inversion. Because that's what this does, right? This isn't just different values. This is actually an inversion of the old values, right? This is taking the old values and turning them on their head, saying the exact opposite of what you said was good is good. The exact opposite of what you thought was bad is bad. And that's very rare. That just doesn't happen that frequently. Good. Any other questions about how are we doing with all this? Is this making some rough degree of sense? Are you seeing, I guess, the schematic shift that Nietzsche's making? Right? It's this idea of turning the values on their head. That's what fascinates him. And then once it happens, it becomes the full-bore dominant forever, right? I mean, it takes a long time. You have lots of various modes, but to all of us now, this sounds awful, right? And in fact, it doesn't even sound awful. We almost can't wrap our heads around it. When I actually try to teach Aristotelian and Platonic virtue ethics in introductory ethics classes, which we'll talk a little bit about later on, right? Which isn't even this. It's actually way closer to the Christian in a lot of respects, but it still has a lot of elements of this. Students don't even get what's being said exactly. They keep waiting for Achilles to do something moral or to be a good person, and he never once does, right? This is so odd to us, we almost can't even understand what it would have been like to think that this is what goodness meant, right? What morality meant, and why all of this matters. So we're getting near the end of today. For our purposes, what's the big upshot of all of this? The slave morality only makes sense, Nietzsche thinks, if it's grounded in something transcendent. Right, so this is our first sort of hint about transcendence that we're going to get. We'll have more to say about it, certainly. But just looking at your life, if you are a Jewish slave in the Roman Empire, you're not going to call yourself the blessed. Your life sucks, right? You can't wash, you can't bathe, you can't exercise, you don't control your own movement. You quite literally have to turn the other cheek, because if your master hits you and you hit your master back, you're going to die. He'll kill you, right? So it's not like a moral prescription so much as a necessity for survival that you turn the other cheek, right? You can't look at your life and be like, yeah, I really am lucky, right? The natural, quote unquote, perspective is the perspective of the noble, right? That's the natural one, right? My life is great because I do whatever I want. Your life sucks. Yeah, sucks to be you, right? If you're just looking at the world around you, if you're just looking at sort of imminent happiness, that's the natural stance. To make this transition to say, we, the suffering, the wretched, we're actually the blessed ones. We're actually the happy ones. And indeed, in Christianity, this takes on, Nietzsche thinks, monstrous heights, where it's the Christ on the cross, the suffering God himself. That is blessedness itself, is the suffer, to die on the cross, to be martyred. That is happiness. You have to go beyond the world just as you look around yourself, the world that you see, right? Aristotle literally says, and again, Aristotle's already even later than this master morality, but he's closer to it in a lot of ways. Aristotle literally says no one would ever say that they were happy if they were being tortured to death. That's nuts. And indeed, 600 years later, that is what the Christian martyrs are going to say, right? That they are at their happiness when they are getting ripped apart by the lion, right? That itself is kind of this moment of blessedness, right? You can only do that. Sorry, I didn't know what that stands. You can only do that if you're transcending the world in some sense. That's sort of a prerequisite. You have to be looking to something beyond yourself, beyond the world that you normally encounter. And that was possible because of the way in which all of this preserves the old priestly values. Right? The old priestly values of sort of the asceticism, they get preserved in the slave morality, and they already contain some hint of this idea of transcendence with the talk of the gods and the worship of the gods and doing things for the gods. Well, next week, I'm going to have you read, we're going to skip over the second book of the genealogy just because we don't have that much time, but we'll jump to the third book. And what Nietzsche's going to be concerned with in the third book, what was actually going on with those priests? Because it's coming out of the priests that you get the slave morality. So what was actually going on with them? And this will give us our first real strong sense of what we actually mean by transcendence, what transcendence actually means in this context. And then once we see how it's working in Nietzsche, we'll then see how it's working in Christian thinkers. And then we're actually going to leave the West. We're going to see how it's working outside of the West as well. So that's our plan for the rest of the semester. We'll need 2 more days to really get a clear sense of what we mean by transcendence, and then we'll start seeing what's actually going on with it in these various traditions. All right, that's what I got for today. Any last questions or comments or anything? This is super weird, right? This is super odd doing it this way. I hope it's going all right. Let me know if there's anything you'd like to be different. I think I'm doing, this is my 3rd run around with teaching a class this way, and I think I'm doing it better than I did the first time at least, but I'm sure there's still room for improvement. So thank you all very much. I'm going to unmute everyone. We're done for the day, but if anyone wants to chat a little bit after class, we can do that. Otherwise, I will see you all on Tuesday. Thank you very much. All right. And if anyone, round, so if anyone wants to talk for a minute or 2, that's fine. But let me mute the echoing me.